It's Father Vogel. We are beginning this series on Saint Jean-Baptiste de La Salle's Meditations in Time of Retreat. And this work is really designed for teachers to reflect upon their role that God has given them in their vocation to educate the youth. But really this applies, as I mentioned in my introductory video, to anybody who's involved in the instruction of the next generations in the faith. So before we get into the meditations themselves as part of this kind of retreat, what I want to do is kind of give some historical background that's important to understand in a better way why Saint Jean-Baptiste has given these reflections. So if we look back to the 17th century, right before de La Salle, there was a kind of education system in France at the time, though it wasn't necessarily incredibly organized. And it was almost entirely designed for those that were rich, the more wealthy people. So you had certain classes in France during that time. You had the very rich and wealthy, then you had kind of the middle-class people, known as the bourgeoisie. And de La Salle's family were actually members of the kind of upper part of the bourgeoisie, middle class. So de Salle himself was able to have a good education because they were able to afford that. There was a kind of societal policy stemming from the influence of the church at that time, that the poor would have opportunities for education, that the teachers wouldn't charge students that were poor that desired to go to school. But the problem is that many poor children didn't go to school anyway, because families often needed them to gain a living wage for their families. As well as the subjects that were taught in the school often didn't really seem to have any kind of direct application to the lives of those that were poor. So if we look at what various kinds of schools that were possible during that time, it'll help us understand why St. Jean-Baptiste formulated his Christian schools. So kind of the highest point, kind of the standard for schooling was being tutored at home by a teacher. So, of course, this was only available to the most wealthy. That you would have one single teacher to instruct your child one-on-one. Incidentally, this is precisely the way that Jean-Baptiste himself learned during his primary years, before going off for further education after that. So only the most wealthy could afford it that way. But we'll find that most schools were kind of, strove to kind of follow the teaching style of that. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So next, we have grammar schools, also possible. Primary schools that were connected in some way with higher level education at university. So students in the grammar school would then be led to participate in the later education as well. Once again, mainly for those that are more well off. Then there were the choir schools, and these were for the boys that were in the choirs of the cathedral. There would be a school associated with that as well. You have your little schools, they were called, that were oversaw by the Guild of Schoolmasters. Then there was convent schools that were run by different religious orders of sisters. Now, these convent schools were girls' schools. Oftentimes, they were for the more wealthy families, because this would be the way in which the sisters would have money to upkeep the order. But there were some also times in which they were being formulated so that you would be able to include poor students as well. So this was really the only type of schools for girls, which you might say is kind of unfair, but in reality, the convent schools were oftentimes more successful than some of these other versions of the schools were. There was also writing schools that was run and regulated by the Guild of Writing Masters, and they really restricted the use of writing in many of the other schools. Then there were the charity schools, which these indeed were for the poor and destitute. Going back to the mid-1500s, the Church's Council of Trent had actually mandated that parishes found schools for those that were poor. But even though there were many parishes that did try to form these schools, like I said, there was these limitations that oftentimes the poor wouldn't attend anyway, because of the subject matters weren't necessarily applicable, and families needed the children also to work. But many parishes made that attempt to formulate it. Oftentimes, too, the teachers that were in the school really didn't have as good of backgrounds, and the educational quality could be hit or miss at times. They rarely had training, really, as teachers. And there were, of course, other schools that were available that formulated individually, sometimes by other religious orders or other groups of people that wanted to address the situation of education for the children. But oftentimes these only lasted a short amount of time, and maybe after that first generation of teachers, it kind of, fell apart, unfortunately. So those are the varying types of schools. So what did, teaching look like? What was the teaching style, the pedagogy that was used for learning? Well, the main thing was just rote memorization. Students would memorize their lessons, and then they would repeat it back to the instructors so that the teacher knew how they were learning. And of course, this is based off of, that highest standard was the one-on-one teacher-to-student tutoring that only the rich could afford. And obviously that's really good if you can do that, but to educate a large number of students, it's really hard to have enough teachers to be able to do that kind of one-on-one, especially, to afford that kind of teaching. So in the classrooms, the kind of pedagogy that you would find is trying to model after that one-on-one tutoring. And so all ages and all abilities of students would all be together in the same room, and you'd have the instructor focusing on one student at a time, and the student would repeat the lessons back to that instructor, and the students would be doing other things while, if you're lucky, they're going to be studying and getting ready for when the teacher is going to come to them. But other times they might be doing other tasks or creatively interacting with one another. Something that boys at that time really got into was gambling. So they might be off in the corner doing that. So sometimes not the greatest learning going on during this. So as we continue then, reading was a major thing that they would learn. That was kind of the focus or priority. But unfortunately, writing oftentimes was not the focus. So, and that had to do with it also being regulated by the guilds of who would be allowed to do that. So, with the reading and writing too, the focus was Latin and Latin grammar, and then before moving on later into the vernacular, the French, which you can see why that wouldn't necessarily be the highest priority for the poor. So Jean-Baptiste will look into, what's going to be the best in that area. When it comes to discipline, corporal punishment was just an ordinary part of the instruction. And teachers themselves were often not really well trained in how to teach, and sometimes it would be kind of like a second career, or even a kind of a second job that they would do. So they weren't really necessarily trained. They might be coming from a military background and not really know much about teaching, or maybe they were, spent most of their time focusing on business, and this was just an extra thing. So it widely varied. There wasn't really a set kind of school schedule. They wouldn't necessarily meet every day. It would always depend upon really, when the students showed up, even when the teacher showed up and decided that he wanted to do instruction for that day. So there really was no kind of organized system of training teachers, and then once they're teaching to really supervise or continue their education themselves. So this is kind of the background that Saint Jean-Baptiste is going to be drawn into in looking at reforming or developing Christian schools in a way that's really going to form not only students but also the teachers themselves. And in their next video, we're going to look more specifically at his life and his development of the Christian schools in order to then embark on the coming videos in his meditations for teachers in time of retreat. God bless.